Greetings, outcasts, free thinkers, narrative questioners, dot connectors, and genuinely open-minded and outright curious inhabitants of whatever realm we exist in at the moment. You are about to embark on another free first-hour episode of The Melt. If you find yourself wanting to dig deeper and have the desire to join the conversation during our monthly Melt meetups, you might want to consider becoming a monthly subscriber. For as little as 3 lousy Babylon hokey-pokey tokens per month, you can have access to full-length, early, and exclusive episodes. Just visit patreon.com/themeltpodcast or click the link in the episode notes to set the process in motion. It's simple, painless, and very well might make you feel tingly inside. So without further ado, please enjoy the show!
This is Hunter Muse.
And this is Chris Snipes, and you are listening
to The Melt.
I've said it here more than once that I would rather spend time with open-minded people rather than like-minded people. The open-minded people can include the like-minded, but sometimes the like-minded aren't open-minded. Once we start viewing the world as consisting of sides, and we then put ourselves into one of those sides, then it really doesn't matter which side one is on. All side-taking is infighting. And all infighting is to fall prey to the illusion of separation. To remain open-minded in the face of subjects or opinions that might challenge one's worldview is an attribute many lack. Social media has indoctrinated us to see people that think differently than us as opponents to shout pejoratives at or as intellectual inferiors. Today's guest, author Mark Gober, came from a Silicon Valley physicalist mindset and found himself exploring topics such as extended consciousness, near-death experiences, and alien contact. I start off the conversation by asking Mark what form his evolution took.
Sure. Well, my background's in business. I used to work in investment banking in New York during the financial crisis, 2008 to 2010. And I left to join a Silicon Valley-based strategy firm, first actually in the Boston office and then in the Bay Area for most of my time there, advising companies with technology. So on the surface, nothing to do with the books that I've written, which are about consciousness and liberty and aliens and UFOs. But in 2016, I became very interested in the nature of reality broadly. I was listening to podcasts. And prior to that point, I thought life was random and meaningless. I thought that's what we learned from science, and the notions from spirituality and religion were just old superstitions that we had evolved past.
Yeah.
That's where my mindset was increasingly. So I thought life was meaningless. And when you die, that's the end. There's no meaning built into the nature of reality itself.
Yeah.
And that's a tough way to be, but to live without actually having real direction. But to me, that's what I was being taught. So I wasn't going to try to change my beliefs just because I didn't like reality. I wanted to face reality. And my beliefs were challenged when I started listening to podcasts in 2016. And I started to hear about the evidence for the paranormal, eventually culminating in my reading books on the topic, looking into scientific papers. And I realized pretty quickly that my old worldview was not correct. And that's the genesis of this journey. I wrote my first book the next year because I was so passionate about it. My life was radically changed. I was still working in my job though, but the first book's called An End to Upside Down Thinking, and it's about the evidence that consciousness does not come from the brain. So the scientific evidence for psychic abilities, the evidence that consciousness survives when the body dies, reincarnation, things like that. And then I produced a podcast series called Where is My Mind, where I interviewed many of the scientists that I wrote about. And that came out in 2019. It's an 8-episode series. And that took me to the end of 2019. I was still in my job, had become a partner after all that time. And I decided I don't want to do this anymore. Even though I had really built my career towards that, I was in objectively a good spot. But I knew I had to do something else, even though I wasn't sure what that would be. So I wanted to give myself space. And long story short, I did leave my job right before all the lockdowns, and I was phasing out of my job, actually working part-time. So by the end of March 2020, I was fully out of my job as lockdowns had hit. And I've written 3 more books since then, and An End to Upside Down Living, which I actually wrote during the pre-lockdown phase, but it was published after. And that's more on the spiritual awakening journey, spiritual philosophy. If you assume consciousness doesn't come from the brain, then how would one live life? That's what that book is about. And then as I saw things happening in the world and paid more attention to politics and the media and things like that, I wrote An End to Upside Down Liberty. And that came out in 2021. And then I started looking into the contact phenomenon, aliens, UFOs, and spirits. And I wrote a book called An End to Upside Down Contact, which came out in the summer of 2022. And here we are now.
Fantastic.
So were you happy in the default world? Like, you were very successful in your academic career and also very successful in the business world. Were you happy at that point?
Or did you
by
think
20?
you were happy?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Chris. What was that?
So did you think that you were happy?
Good questions. By the time we got to 2016 and maybe starting 2014, 2015, so this is leading up to my awakening, if you want to call it that, I was not in a good place then. So I knew I wasn't happy and that I was on this treadmill. And anytime I achieved something, I was like going back to a baseline level of happiness. Mm-hmm. So by that point, the ups and downs of life I wasn't handling those as well. And I didn't have direction. But prior to that, I don't think I would have called myself unhappy. I was still very engaged in life, and I still cared about a lot of the things that I care about now that I have a spiritual worldview. Like I wanted to act with integrity and honesty. I wanted to be a good person to other people, but I didn't see fundamental meaning behind it. But I think maybe some of the reason that I was still happy at those earlier phases was I didn't realize it was a treadmill. I thought maybe those future things that I'm trying to achieve would bring the happiness that everyone talks about. Mm-hmm. So I was looking forward to something that actually didn't exist. In that ignorance, I was a pretty happy person generally. Sure. I mean, I was very stressed out because I was always like, whether I was working in investment banking and in college, I went to Princeton, which is academically rigorous. And I was on the tennis team there, which is a Division I program. So I was working really hard, but I wasn't unhappy in that process.
Yeah, it's a kind of default happy. It's a happy that you're supposed to be. You keep buying these things and filling your life with material objects and certain goals that you're supposed to reach at a certain time in your career or whatever. Yeah. And then obviously podcasts sort of created a schism in your world. It's great that podcasts matter. That makes us feel good.
Yeah,
and
they
then,
do.
Yeah. So there must have been something that hooked you. Like were you interested in that sort of stuff to begin with, or did it just happen to crack open a whole new world for you?
Well, if I look at my earlier life, even back in high school and maybe before, I remember asking questions like, why do we exist? Looking up at the stars and wondering what our place is. So there's a part of me that probably knew or wondered back then. Yeah. And when I went to Princeton, I didn't know what I wanted to study. And I started off in the economics department just because, like you're saying, Chris, sort of like a default thing to do. If you want to work in the world in business, it's good to have an economics background. But I wasn't enjoying it. I found it to be too theoretical, especially some of the mathematical stuff. It just didn't seem that practical to me. And I thought about switching my major. This is when I was a sophomore. So there was still time to switch before, I forget, second half of sophomore year was when you had to decide, or maybe before junior year, something like that. And I had taken a course in astrophysics, and I was so fascinated by it. It was an introductory course. And I was so interested in the topic that I met with the head of the astrophysics department to try to switch majors. And she said I could do it, but I would have to catch up with a lot of really advanced math classes and some hardcore physics. And I just thought to myself, there's no way I'm going to do this with my tennis commitments, because I really care about grades. And I knew maybe I wouldn't do so well trying to catch up in some of these classes, and maybe I wouldn't have an advantage or whatever. That's the way I was thinking. So I decided not to do it. And I switched my major to psychology, which is still relevant to a lot of the things I think about now, like human behavior, what's actually going on behind the scenes. That's what psychology gets into. And that's what I ended up majoring in and focusing on a split between psychology and economics. So I wrote my thesis on behavioral economics. And then after that, after graduating, I went into investment banking, where there was no time to think about anything other than completing what my superiors in the office needed me to do. I literally had no time to do anything else. I wasn't sleeping. It was very unhealthy, but I signed up for it. I agreed to do it, but I wasn't thinking existentially. When I left the firm in New York in 2010, I first moved to the next firm's Boston office before moving to Silicon Valley. And there actually was a phase where I started reading a bunch. And it was kind of a hybrid of psychology. I remember reading Richard Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, and thinking it was the best book, such an important book, because it was dispelling all the superstitions.
Of course.
So there was this part of me that had maybe academic interest, and I had a little more time, even though I was still working hard. I was looking into those things. And then I got really so consumed by work again for several years. I wasn't reading as much. And then in 2016, podcasts started to become a little bit bigger. And I remember a friend sent me a podcast on the Tim Ferriss show in, I think it was early 2016. I probably have the email somewhere. And it was an interview with Mark Andreessen, I believe, who's a venture capitalist. I said, wow, this is so cool. You can listen to these experts all over the world in their respective topics. And that inevitably led me to listen to a bunch of other podcasts, including some shows in the health space, and particularly the alternative health space. I listened to a show called Extreme Health Radio, and there was an episode that came on of a woman named Laura Powers, who talked about psychic abilities that she had, and that she used to work in higher education and politics, had a master's degree, and seemed like a reasonable human being, and talked about communicating with angels and having psychic phenomena and working with clients. So at the end of that episode, Laura said, well, I have my own podcast called Healing Powers, where I interview a lot of other people that have these experiences. So I said, okay, let me listen to this other show. It didn't change my life to hear that. I was interested, but it didn't shift me.
Sure.
But then I listened to her podcast, which are relatively short episodes. And I had a drive from San Francisco down to Silicon Valley, lots of traffic. So I had hours in the car. So I'd listen to multiple episodes a day, just driving to and from work. And I was hearing person after person describe a view of reality that was totally foreign to me. And these people had independent accounts, and they were converging in the worldview. So I was thinking, okay, they couldn't be colluding with each other, because these people are totally separate.
Yeah.
Right.
So either they're deluded in exactly the same way, or there's some truth to it, or maybe some of them are lying. I need to figure this out.
Right.
And then things accelerated.
That's amazing that something was nudging you forward in this process. It wasn't like there was a click, like an aha moment. It was more of this very kind of a slow slog that you went through to get there.
Yes. Although there were points of acceleration when I look back. So even before hearing Laura Powers on Extreme Health Radio, I was listening to alternative health. So that tells you something.
Sure.
But I remember Tim Ferriss talking about sensory deprivation flotation tanks, where you get in a saltwater tank, it's dark.
Yep.
So I was doing sensory deprivation, just because I said, wow, this seems like a really interesting thing to do. You don't actually have to do psychedelics, but maybe you could have a similar effect, and people have very positive changes from it. So isn't that interesting that I was doing sensory deprivation, which is a form of really hardcore meditation?
Exactly.
Think about it.
For sure.
And then my world started to open up. And I think along the journey of some other acceleration points, it was a few weeks into listening to Laura Powers' podcast, which this was 2016, and she had started her podcast in 2011. I listened to all the episodes going back to 2011,
Amazing.
starting with the more recent episodes.
Right.
And one of the earlier ones was with Paul Davids, who is a Hollywood producer, produced the Transformers, but he also has a documentary on Roswell and had paranormal experiences with his deceased colleague who said, I'm an atheist, but if I die and there is something after, I will drop you a line.
Wow.
And then things started to happen when his colleague died.
Wow.
He wrote a book called An Atheist in Heaven, and he described on this podcast some of the very strange things that happened to him, which I wrote about in my first book, An End Upside Down Thinking, and I interviewed Paul Davids for my podcast. But one of the experience that stood out for me, and I remember when I heard this, I couldn't move in my chair. He talked about he was alone in his home in New Mexico. So no one else was there, and he was reading papers, left the room and came back, and there was wet ink on the paper that he was reading. And the words that were crossed out corresponded to something related to the person who had died. Wow. And he had the ink blot tested by chemists for 3 years, funded it himself, and there were strange properties that they couldn't explain. There are many other incidents that he describes in his book. I forget, maybe 300 plus.
Wow.
He goes through each one. But I remember hearing that one, Hunter, and thinking, wow, like something's going on. I was looking around the room. Are there things that I can't see? And there were other instances. Another one I'll mention was, this was maybe October of 2016. I read the book, Your Soul's Plan by Robert Schwartz. Mm-hmm. One of the first books I'd read, because I listened to a lot of podcasts. He is a past life regression hypnotherapist and works with people not only on their past lives, but the period between lives, which people spontaneously describe under hypnosis. They talk about choosing the next life. And he wrote a book where he wanted to test this to see if it was really happening by interviewing the soul of the person that claimed to have a previous life or between life.
Right.
He interviewed the soul by talking to channels, so people that could psychically tap into someone's soul. Mm-hmm. And the theme of the book was an idea that still blows my mind, that people who have had major life challenges, or really all of us for that matter, to some degree planned those challenges before birth for the purpose of soul evolution. And when he interviewed the souls of all these people who had horrible traumas like cancer, suicide, goes chapter by chapter, basically a major life challenge, and then has a person that had that challenge. Mm-hmm. What he found over and over again was that to some degree, the person planned that challenge before birth, and maybe it could have been avoided if the person had learned, but there was a learning through the challenge. And the ultimate goal was for the person to achieve self-love to some degree. But the idea is that we are here on an evolutionary journey, and certain things that might have seemed horribly traumatic actually led to something positive, either on a metaphysical level, or sometimes the person actually had a life transformation. I remember reading that book and thinking to myself, I can't prove whether these are real cases, but that concept changed things for me. So there are a bunch of other cases along the way where my growth or my worldview change had been accelerated. But like you said, Hunter, it was steady. Mm-hmm. I didn't have a near-death experience or a DMT psychedelic experience where overnight it all changed. Mm-hmm. It was definitely gradual.
And how did your friends react to this pivot?
Yeah. At first, I didn't talk about it.
Of course.
Because I didn't even know there was a world of people that knew this stuff.
Right.
And now I know there's a whole community, but I was so disconnected from that. I thought maybe I'm going crazy here. What am I supposed to do? And the way I handled that was I just wanted to learn more. So when I wasn't in the office working, all I did was I just wanted to listen to podcasts, read books. And there were a few friends that I felt comfortable talking to about this stuff. And I became more and more comfortable over that year, where actually I would go to dinners with people and we just catch up as friends. And then I would describe some of the studies that I had learned about, like a near-death experience or children with past life memories at the University of Virginia, things like that.
Right.
And people they were just totally blown away. And sometimes people would say things to me afterwards, like, Mark, I'm still thinking about that conversation we had. That's wild stuff. And the more I did that, I realized I need to share this material, because when I started, there was no plan to be public or write books.
Right.
This was not on my radar. I was career focused at that point. I wasn't a partner at the firm yet. I'd worked my way up pretty close, but that's what I was focused on, and working with my clients. It was heavy duty. But then in the summer of 2017, something hit me of like, wait, I should just put this into a book. That would be a really powerful thing because I have a business background. Maybe I'll get to reach certain people who wouldn't listen to others in the space just because of my background.
Right.
And I decided to write it. And I took the 4th of July weekend in 2017, which was a long weekend, and basically locked myself in my apartment in San Francisco and said, I'm going to write as much as I can. Like an investment banker, I'm not going to sleep, although my body shut down and I had to sleep bits and pieces. But I wrote probably more than half of the book, the first book, that long weekend. And once I had that base, I was able to finish it for the next few weekends because I knew what was going to be next. Mm-hmm. And then at that point, I was out. And when the book was published in 2018, there was no turning back, but I became less and less self-conscious about it. I mean, as you can probably tell, like the books that have come afterwards are more esoteric.
Yes.
Because I'm interested in what's true. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the truth is, but I want to explore it. And whatever I used to think was true, I think I was very wrong.
Mm-hmm. I like how they're presented too, as if they're not like written like inside baseball. They're presented as like, well, this, hold on, but this may floor you, but this is, these are some things that people have been talking about and doing research on and uncovering. And I like that. I think it's when it's presented that way and the way that you have the covers and everything, it makes it more accessible for people maybe who wouldn't be so apt to dip their toe into these topics, which I think are all very pertinent. And they're so condensed too. There's so much information there. And it's interesting. I heard many interviews for the Contact book, and people were like, I had a hard time reading parts of it. But I think Liberty, the one before it, the End to Upside Down Liberty, there's some much more darker things in there, I think, because they're more worldly in a sense. Like they're very tangible. I mean, not that the things in Contact aren't, but
yeah.
So do you get a lot of people who come up to you or write you or whatever saying, thank you, I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time and now you've kind of helped me to come closer to these subjects?
I do hear from people every now and then, but I don't hear from that many people overall.
Oh.
So it's hard for me to gauge sometimes what the actual reaction is. And sometimes I'll hear from someone and they'll say, oh, my friend read your book and it had a big impact. So I'll hear through that. And it was maybe several years ago that they read the book. This is part of being a content producer. And maybe as podcast hosts, you experience this too. You're probably impacting so many people that you will never know you impacted. So that's just the indirect, the lack of direct feedback is something I didn't anticipate. Like when I worked in the business world and I give a client presentation, they're in the room with me. So I was getting immediate feedback.
Exactly.
I may never hear from people. So that's the big answer, but I do hear bits and pieces from people.
Sure.
And with the Contact book, like you said, there's a variety of reactions, but I do talk about some very dark topics. Mm-hmm. I give glimpses into that, and some people had a hard time with that, I know. And then the concepts in general, the notion of non-human intelligence, other dimensions, that's heavy stuff. But on the Liberty book, I think the few reactions I've heard are the most extreme. So some people that like the Liberty book will say that it was their favorite of my books. And the ones that don't like it will be extremely negative. Like, I used to like you before, Mark, but now I just can't.
Yeah, you went there. You totally went there. Yeah, I love it. Bringing metaphysics into it too. I thought that was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. Well, I think that was the gap I was trying to fill, because a lot of the topics I talk about, which I'm sure we'll get into, the notion of voluntarism and liberty, mind control, I tried to aggregate and simplify things that have been written elsewhere. But in the political literature and also the economic literature, I didn't see a tie to metaphysics very often.
Yeah.
So I thought there was an opportunity there to tie the work that I had done before to thinking about how to optimally structure society, to actually align it with reality.
Absolutely. And even people who are very into the Constitution sometimes don't take it a step further and go into the fact that was a document that was supposed to protect your God-given rights. It wasn't going to. That's not a document to give you rights. It's to protect the God-given rights that you already have, which goes back to natural law, which is very metaphysical. It's all about the spirit of man and being a fully realized, multidimensional human being, and all the responsibilities, ethical responsibilities that go along with that.
Yes. And it requires what you just said, I agree with, but having that point of view requires understanding the metaphysics and believing that there is meaning built into reality itself. If you have an atheistic or agnostic view, then natural rights, what's that? Because we're a product of a random evolutionary process that's taken 13.8 billion years, and the human being randomly emerged. There's no natural law. That's one could argue, but with the metaphysical background, and like I talk about in the Liberty book, the near-death experience gets into natural law, where people report a life review.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll take a step back. What's a near-death experience for those who aren't familiar? Because I wasn't familiar until I started researching several years ago. These are instances where a person has some kind of trauma to the body, typically. Cardiac arrest is a good example. Heart stops beating, blood stops flowing to the brain after a certain amount of time, and the person's clinically dead. And yet sometimes, actually, Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, ran a study that was published in the Lancet Journal on cardiac arrest patients. 18% of the people that had cardiac arrest and were resuscitated in his study reported a near-death experience, meaning they had lucid experiences, memories, things that were realer than real. Sometimes they hovered outside their body. They saw things which were verified by the people in the room after they were resuscitated, which means it's not a hallucination. It's verified memory. So there's a lucid consciousness happening at a time when the brain shouldn't be able to make that kind of consciousness. And to quote Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, when I interviewed him for my podcast, he said, we're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever, which suggests that the near-death experience might actually liberate consciousness from the body and we experience the broader reality. And I give that preface because the life review phenomenon, which is often reported in near-death experiences, maybe that's not a hallucination. Maybe it's a real thing. And what they report is that they become the people that they impacted during their life. They relive their life in a short, compressed amount of time. So something's going on with time, where, like Einstein's relativity, time isn't just a fixed thing. It can be stretched out or compressed.
Right.
That seems to be happening because they're living their lives in a flash, but they become the people that they interacted with. They get to feel what it was like when they acted in a loving manner, for example, or if they acted in an unloving manner, they get to feel that as that person through that person's eyes. For my podcast, I interviewed Daniel Brinkley, who's had 4 near-death experiences over several decades. And each time he had a life review that he was able to remember. And he started each one at the beginning of his life. So there were certain things that he relived 4 times, including his combat time in Vietnam, where he killed people and he relived the deaths of the people that he killed. And he felt what it was like to be the children who would no longer have fathers because he killed the fathers in combat. So all this is to say is that something is built into the nature of reality itself, where we are interconnected. And when consciousness is liberated from the brain, maybe we're able to take on that interconnected mindset somehow. I don't understand how. And Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia wrote a book called After, which came out in 2021 on near-death experiences.
We had him on the podcast about that book.
Okay. Okay, great. And what he says in that book is what he hears from people about the life review phenomenon in near-death experiences is that it's actually beyond morality. And to your point, Chris, he says it's natural law. This idea of treating others as we would like to be treated because we are the same, or put another way, we should be moving toward a state of unconditional love. That's what people often report. Because I have heard other people distort the golden rule and say, well, I'm a masochist, so I'm going to treat you the way I like to be treated, which is harmful. That's a distortion too. So it's treating people well is what the life review teaches us. And if that's a real principle, if it's natural law that we should try to treat people well, then how does that imply we should structure society? And that's how I tie in the politics and the economics.
Yeah. And how voluntarism is a much more a kindred philosophy to that, as opposed to what we have now, which is total corrupt and manipulated by money and special interests and stuff like that, which it's very self-serving. And voluntarism, and I've been wanting to have somebody on the podcast to talk about this. Maybe you can sum that up and how that incorporates this sort of philosophy too.
Sure. Well, it's somewhat new to me. I had never heard the term voluntarism until I started researching, like in the 2020, 2021 era. I didn't have a political leaning before that because I just didn't care about politics. I didn't even really know the difference between the parties. And then 2020 hit, and like we're sitting at home because many people are locked down, and I started paying much more attention. So that's my political background. I didn't come in as a libertarian or a Democrat or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So I wanted to get to the fundamentals of government as I started to look into it, because there were things that I agreed with when I heard people on the left, and even on the right I agreed, and even on the libertarians, there were different aspects that I agreed with, but there's something more fundamental than left-right. And that's what I get into in the book, and End Upside Down Liberty. And it's ultimately statism versus voluntaryism. Statism is the belief in government, whether it's a liberal government or a conservative government. The idea that we have a government, and this is the key point, that is compulsory.
Yes.
It's compulsory. It's something that we didn't contractually sign up for. Chris didn't say, I'm going to hire this government to provide all these services like roads and courts and military, and I'm not going to voluntarily ask for these things. It's going to be imposed upon me, and I will pay for those things in taxes, because if I don't, then I go to jail or my assets are seized. Exactly. I have to, it's compulsory payment. And it's effectively having a ruling class, but it's, I call it a wolf in sheep's clothing, because it's framed to us as a benevolent force that wants to help the people. And there certainly have been and are politicians that care about the people. So I don't want to say anyone in politics or within the state is bad, but the structure itself is inherently problematic from a spiritual standpoint, because it can compel you to do things that you didn't ask for. And we've seen throughout history how this can go horribly wrong when you think of the worst communist regimes, fascism, where governments become totally corrupt in a very obvious way. But even in the modern world, in quote unquote democratic societies, governments can compel people to do things that they don't agree with. They can force people to pay for things that they find immoral.
Yep,
exactly.
That's a big issue. I mean, let's say you don't agree with the war. Well, your tax money might go to that war, whether or not you like it. Yeah. That's problematic spiritually, to have to fund something that you don't disagree with morally.
For sure.
So these were things that I had never considered, and it was totally mind blowing to just rethink the nature of the state. And that led me into ultimately the work of the Austrian School of Economics, which is the work of Murray Rothbard, for example, or Ludwig von Mises. There's an institute in Auburn, Alabama called the Mises Institute. I actually spoke there this past year at the Austrian Economics Research Conference, where they talk about these ideas of getting away from statism, but more from the economic perspective, why that's valuable. So to your question, Chris, about voluntarism is essentially the inverse of statism. So it's everything that you do in society has to be on a voluntary basis. And it's based on the non-aggression principle, which to me is a spiritual principle. And it says the following, that you should not initiate aggression against another person's body or the property that they own. And if someone initiates aggression against you or your property, you have a right to self-defense. So what is aggression? Aggression could be physical violence, fraud, coercion, extortion, theft. Any of those things could be a form of aggression. And when it's put that way, you realize, wait a second, the government does this all the time. They are an aggressive force. They can coerce people to do things. Exactly. They could say, oh, well, we didn't force you to take the injection. We just made it really difficult if you said no. That's a form of coercion. Same with taxes. Well, you want to think it's voluntary, but really if you don't pay, that's a big problem. You're breaking the law. So that's voluntarism. That's really all it is, the non-aggression principle. And when one applies the non-aggression principle to politics and to economics, what you start to realize is that we live in a very backward society spiritually, because the government can do things you didn't ask them to do. They can distort the economy, which is altering the value of your property in ways that you didn't ask for. So in the book, I get into the Austrian School of Economics, which basically looks at not only what is the problem when the state intervenes in the economy, but what might an economy look like if we didn't have government at all? Could it function? Most of us haven't thought of that. I had never thought of that. Like, how would there be like road servicing and police and military, and what would happen to the environment? So they go through theoretical exercises of, well, all of those things that I mentioned and anything these are functions that are performed by human beings. And right now the human beings are in government and we just have to pay for it, even if we don't want to. Yeah. What if there was a free market where people could provide services based on consumer demand? And so you could have privatized police forces, and maybe it would look a little bit different than we currently do, because entrepreneurs create things that we can't always conceive of. So that's some of the thought exercise I went through in the book of like, how could we privatize all this stuff that's in the public sector, and why might that actually be better? And the more I looked into it and looked at like Murray Rothbard's work and other people, I realized government as we do it is not uniquely qualified to do anything. It can provide services, but it doesn't have the accountability that a private business does.
Right.
If you perform poorly in the marketplace, people will go to someone else.
Exactly.
And you might go out of business. So you have this financial incentive to want to do well. Government, we don't have that. We actually sometimes have the perverse incentive where if you do poorly, then you could say, well, like we need more money to the education sector because we need more funding.
Yes.
But maybe that's because they did poorly. So it's start to realize that the government is problematic from many lenses. And that's what the book's about.
So do you think that one of the reasons that we people co-sign on consensus reality, like people in the business sector that you were working in, do they do that out of fear because it's too frightening to imagine a world of voluntarism?
I think part of it is that people have not thought this through.
Yeah, for sure.
I wasn't aware of it until 2021. Never heard the term before. I had just heard of different ideas on how to structure the state and different disagreements on we should fund this more and this less. But that still presupposes that there is a state handling it. So part of it is education, to know that this exists and then to deep dive into it. Because it wasn't like I heard it and I said, there's something here I've got to get into, but I hadn't thought through all the different possibilities and gone through privatization and listened to the Austrian economists. And like I spent so much time with the Mises Institute on their website. They have free books written by these amazing economists. Some of them are on audiobook for free also. So it's an amazing resource, and lectures by there's a YouTube page. So I had to really immerse myself to redo my thinking about economics. That was really important. And they simplify it in a way that was helpful. So unless you do go through that process, I don't think it's automatic. So that's number one, is awareness. But let's say you are aware and have a willingness to engage in political and economic thought, because I've encountered this too. There's still big resistance.
Right.
I think some of it's fear. Some of it is that people have biases about the way things should be. So I'll give you an extreme example. And this is where I end up splitting with the spiritual community very often, which is, to me, it's frustrating and perplexing because there's so much good that comes from the spiritual mindset of like, treat others well, we're all interconnected. But the application of those principles seems off base to me. And I'll give you an example. Spiritual socialism or spiritual communism. The idea that, Mark, there's no private property. You're being selfish because we're all interconnected. There's no such thing as private property. That's just a human construct. Mm-hmm. I've heard these arguments from very smart people.
Sure.
Now, to me, that's a distortion of spirituality. And it gets to a concept that I talk about in my second book, and Into Upside Down Living, and I talk about it in Liberty as well, that there are multiple levels of reality. There is an absolute level of reality that some call where you are oneness. Mm-hmm. So when people take DMT, for example, dimethyltryptamine, or they have a near-death experience or a meditation experience, they feel oneness, that they are one with everything. There's no separation.
Right.
But that's a different level of reality. That's not the one that we operate on, where we are interconnected at one level, but there's a you and a me.
Right.
And at that level, that means there has to be some separation, because if there isn't, imagine you have a house with the food in it. If that's not your property, then someone can just come in your house and sleep on the couch and take your food. That doesn't work in reality, to have no lines. So it's this idealistic perspective that it doesn't apply to reality, and yet it's being applied, I think, very inappropriately. And socialism and communism are this idea of a lack of private property, that you don't actually own the things you produce. You don't own anything. The community does. The community gets to decide. So to me, one of the big concepts here is, yes, we're interconnected and we should try to help others, but individual and personal responsibility and borders and boundaries are an important part of that. And let's come together, but within that context of making your own decisions first. To me, this is critical. And I'm seeing it, in my view, being misinterpreted. And people go to an extreme with this of we need more government to get involved, because we need to reallocate. This person has too much of a certain resource. We need to give it to this person. And a third party is making this decision as if they're godly and they know what's best for everyone. Don't worry. We call it government and therefore it's going to be benevolent. That's the psychology that I see. So Hunter, to your question, there's some of that like ingrained belief systems that I have found that this might be even harder than the metaphysical stuff for people to have a shift. Yeah, political beliefs. Mm-hmm. I don't fully understand the psychology behind it, but it's very strong.
Yeah. It's like we've almost become so used to shitty systems that we're more than willing to settle for the less shitty one. It's like, come on. And idealism is seen as something like some antiquated fantasy or something. Like, since when did we stop living our lives not aiming for higher ideals? Like that should be an important thing, like to aim for higher spiritual ideals where everybody is equal and important. And utopia is impossible. Why even think about it? It's like, why not think about it? Shouldn't that be our end goal? I mean, obviously it's not possible maybe to keep everybody happy unless we're all spiritually enlightened at the same time. Some of us are, it's a slower process for others than some of us, but so, yeah, I think that we're just so used to crappy systems that we don't even think that it's worth trying. Like the two-party democratic system is the way to go, which is absolutely not at all.
Well, I also think
so good.
I just quickly want to say, I think also one of the challenges is that when, we have splintered off into these communal living situations, we kind of end up with the same problems. So there has to be a leader. There has to be someone who's kind of guiding the ship, because you can't live in this polyamorous world where people are sleeping with each other's wives and husbands and we feel like it's all going to work out. And there's always going to be someone who maybe feels a sense of lack, or there isn't a sense of community there.
That's where I think personal accountability and responsibility and having some groundedness comes in to any of these systems. They can't work without grounded, centered, people who are self-aware. But anyway, what were you going to say, Mark? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And even in that kind of a scenario where it is more communal living, the way I look at voluntarism is that if people want to be part of such a community, then that's their choice to engage. And in a voluntarist society, you might have many different types of mini communities that people subscribe to voluntarily. And it might be one that's horrible, but it's their own decision that they made it. It wasn't the third party government that told them to do it. Right. So I'm all for letting people do what they want to do. And because also to me, that's a spiritual idea, because if you believe that we're here to evolve at the level of our consciousness, which to me, that's my general metaphysics, is that we're here at the soul level, like the part of us that experiences the body, that we are a consciousness inhabiting a body and learning things. And through reincarnation and the life review, it's like a mechanism for some kind of growth. If you believe that, then difficulties or making mistakes are part of our growth. So we need to be allowed to make mistakes on our own terms. That's the way I look at it. And some of the pushback I get from people that are very upset with me for talking about things like this, if this is so unrealistic, Mark, there would be complete chaos. Bad things would happen. And to me, it's like, I agree, this is an imperfect system because there are human beings. I think it's relatively less imperfect than having the state, but at least people are learning on their own terms.
Yes.
And that's a positive thing.
Exactly. Consensuality.
Yes. And by the same token, I don't think that implies that if people are doing horrible things within a voluntarist society to say, oh, that's just their problem and they're learning, I'm just going to ignore it. I think there's a responsibility of other people to try to help. But you can't force people to change. That's the way I look at it. And I have to think about that a lot with my work of like, I put it out there. I'm not trying to force people to change, but I want to make the information available in the same way that like we might give advice to a friend, like, hey, I think it would be really good for you to do X, Y, and Z. It might be helpful. And you could take that advice and listen or not, but it's up to you to make that decision. And I just think we have to get to a society that's more like that. Whereas right now we have this Stockholm syndrome thing where we like our abuser. We want a mommy and daddy to take care of us. It's this lack of maturity that, oh, there's a problem. therefore the government should solve it. We need more government to solve it. It's like this knee-jerk reaction.
Exactly.
But it's the assumption of benevolence, and we don't think about the way in which the government might actually be looking out for itself, the individuals looking out for themselves. One of my favorite quotes is from P.J. O'Rourke, who says that when buying and selling are controlled by legislation, the first things to be bought and sold are legislators.
Exactly.
Yep.
This gets to the heart of it, of why we shouldn't just say that they're going to take care of everything.
Yeah. They're not beyond corruption by any means. Were you going to say something?
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's wild when you have a government official saying that people should only be able to make a certain amount of money. That if you achieve a certain level of success from your own innovation, that there should be a cap on that. Like, that's utter insanity.
I completely agree with you. And what people often do is they invoke the notion of inequality, which is worth talking about. What does inequality really mean when people say that? Usually in today's society, they mean, well, these people here are poor and these people are rich. And it's a problem because those people shouldn't be rich. There's this, I don't know if it's a psychological form of envy, that might be part of it, but there's a cultural idea that it's bad to be rich. I want to talk about that, and then I want to get to this notion of inequality. These are such pivotal ideas. I'm glad we're discussing them, because a lot of my interviews, this doesn't come out. If you become rich through legitimate means, meaning not through criminal means, generally, that means that you have provided a good or service that a lot of people wanted or found valuable, and therefore they compensated you for that. Why is that a bad thing? Assuming it's not through criminal means.
Sure.
Right. There was some kind of voluntary exchange by which you obtained that wealth, which was in some way providing a service to people. So to me, there's no problem with that. I don't understand the psychology in the world to try to say these people are bad because they are wealthy. Now, maybe in some cases they have become very selfish. They haven't used those funds well. I think there's a real responsibility to be stewards of that wealth.
Absolutely.
To do well. But the act of obtaining wealth, I don't see as spiritually problematic at all. And I know a lot of people disagree with me. But on this notion of inequality, I think inequality is built into the nature of reality itself. That at some level we are not equal because we are one consciousness. That's at least how I look at it. But we're all very different.
Exactly.
And that's a feature. That's not a bug. That's a good thing that we're different, because we're unique vehicles to be of service in some way. Like the way I talk about it in my books is that we're like puzzle pieces in some kind of cosmic puzzle, but we're unique puzzle pieces, and you need to be that uniqueness. So when I hear about this idea, well, we have to get rid of inequality and like force people to be the same, this term equity comes up a lot, which ultimately means that there are equal outcomes. And one way to think about that is, if one person in school gets an A, another person gets a C on a test, and you say, well, that person, that's unequal. We're going to take some of the points from the person who got an A and give it to the person who got a C. They both get Bs. That's way better. That's evil, in my opinion. That's taking from someone. That's that's like compassion. It's evil masquerading as compassion.
Exactly.
Legislated compassion.
Legislated, right.
And you cannot create equal outcomes with equal opportunity. You just can't, because we are all so different. So you can give every student the same exact test, but it doesn't mean that they're going to have the same outcome with the same information, because we're all processing information differently based on our life experience, based on our spiritual experience. So I think that's the thing that is trying to be controlled, is that outcome.
Yes. That's what you just described on the academic level is a microcosm for what we're seeing. There's this desire to control everything, and equality is one of the big buzzwords. But I can understand where the impulse comes from, because I think for a lot of people, it does come from compassion. They see poverty, which ironically is happening in cities where there's typically more government control, Democrat-run cities, which that's the irony of it, because that is the philosophy that tends to be more compassionate in theory for those less privileged. But I understand where that's coming from. And I don't think we should ignore that either. I think as people within society as part of a spiritual reality. We should try to be charitable and help people who are struggling. So I think that's important too. But this notion that because some people are struggling, that means that people who did really well, that's problematic. It's counter to spirituality in another way, in that I think we're here to obtain some kind of excellence, to be the best version of the puzzle piece that we can be. There's a new book out by Vivek Ramaswamy called Nation of Victims. And he makes this point that there's this victim mentality everywhere, where it's like, it's better if you're a victim.
Yes.
It's a competition to see who's more victimized. Yep. Whereas it should be the opposite. Let's try to excel as much as possible. Exactly. And those who are struggling, let's try to help them excel. It's just a different mindset. Yeah, go ahead.
I just noticed, like, when
you just butted in line.
Sorry. When I was in Mexico, a great example was I saw children on the street whose parents set them out to beg for money because they get more money than adults do. And one thing that I was really struck by is, instead of asking the child, or the parent even for that matter, what do you need? We give candy. We go to places and give them something that we think we would want if we were in that same situation, as opposed to looking specifically at that situation and asking the person in the situation. So the government's giving people money or giving them services where that's not necessarily what those folks need
or want.
Yes. And it gets to one of the really important issues that's discussed in the Austrian School of Economics, which to me, when I heard this, I'm like, wow, this is a spiritual principle. They might not even realize it to be this way. The idea is that within an economy of human beings in society, each person has very diverse preferences. Mm-hmm. So the things that they like or the things they don't like, they're very diverse across people. But even within a person, they can change in an unpredictable manner. And the example I give in the book is ice cream flavors. Let's say someone really likes chocolate ice cream, doesn't like vanilla very much. And all of a sudden it changes where it's like, I don't like chocolate quite as much. I like vanilla more. You could have the smartest PhDs in the world or a supercomputer that wouldn't be able to account for that human consciousness aspect, which is completely unpredictable. So multiply that one preference for ice cream I just mentioned by every preference that one individual has, multiplied by every person in the economy, in society. There is no group body of people that could properly manage such an economy. It's impossible. And that's what the Austrian school asserts, that when they try to come in as a central planner, even if they intend to be benevolent, they will make mistakes because they don't know all the preferences, and the preferences change unpredictably.
I think going back to rich and poor and why do people hate rich people, I think what I went to in my mind is the thing that I've seen reoccur with rich people, with wealthy people, is that they seem to, during the process of acquiring that wealth, no matter how they acquired it, they seem to lose touch or have this amnesia about what it was like before that, or they lose track of, like, their priorities shift sometimes rather drastically, often to things that seem to be more petty in comparison to somebody who really is needing to survive and get by on day to day. So I think that's always made me sort of sneer throughout my life, is that nothing against wealth in and of itself, but the wealthy often just seem to lose touch with the natural order of things. I just wanted to interject that.
Yeah, I want to comment on that because that's a good point. It's very valid. It's something I saw in my professional career as well, especially at the very, very high levels of wealth that I sometimes encountered. In order to get to that level, you really have to prioritize making money. It's hard to just beat everyone out by that much. And it takes a certain personality type to get there, which can result in some of the negative things you're describing, Chris, and maybe a lack of empathy, just a single focus in life. But to me, the issue then is not that person shouldn't have money. It's about shifting that person's consciousness, that person has a responsibility and a duty. Yeah. And if the person doesn't act responsibility with his or her resources that the person has obtained, that's on his or her soul. That's that person's karma to deal with it. and there might be retribution for not being responsible with it, which is handled on some other level of reality. So to me, it's the societal solution I hear very often, especially on the left, is, well, we need to tax them more. There should be no such thing as inheritance. All these things of like, it's their property. They should not have any control over their property because they're wealthy and because maybe we don't like the way they act. To me, it's, well, no, let's try to shift their consciousness, and they will be responsible for their results.
It's interesting because a few years ago, I read an article in the New York Times that was saying that wealthy people don't see homelessness. They don't, like, it's almost like they have blinders on and they don't perceive the world that is going on around them because they live in a very specific bubble. But I think that touches on what you're saying, is that you can teach empathy. You can tune people into a different frequency of their reality other than the one that they're experiencing on a daily basis.
Exactly. I think that's the task. And it's not just for wealthy people. It's for people on all levels of society. But we do see this a lot at that level because of what it is sometimes required for the person to obtain that wealth. There might be this laser focus and they don't see some of the problems, or they don't want to think about it. This is another issue that I've seen a lot of, especially in investment banking. People work really, really, really hard. I mean, they're sacrificing their whole life, and they do well. They make a lot of money, but they're sacrificing. And sometimes they might not want to think about those other issues because they just need to take a break. They want to go with their spouse on a nice vacation, and they worked hard. They earned that money. They made sacrifices. So part of it might also be that there's literally not time to think about some of that stuff because they're so consumed with work and then whatever is immediately in front of them with their family and going on vacation or whatever it is. But it's easier to fall into that trap, that cycle, without having a spiritual worldview. And I really saw that when I worked in New York, of people who, especially the new people that started, because I got to see the transformations of people that would come in so nice and positive and optimistic, like just the most positive people. And then you could see them getting worn down. Yeah. And within a few months, there was just a constant scowl because that's just the nature of the business, how it works. So when you're in that mindset, it's hard to think about, I'm going to be so charitable and I'm so worried about these other things, because people have their own struggles, even within among the wealthy.
And it's also that I think there's a segment of the population that feels like, okay, I write a check and then I've done my work. I've done my charity work. So it's not the day-to-day machinations of seeing people on the street and giving someone money or actually trying to help on a local level. It's seeing something greater than that and saying, well, I gave $10,000 to this charity, and so I'm done. I'm good for the year. And again, it goes back to that thing of like, are you serving your ego by doing that, or are you serving the greater good or people that really need to be served, that you could actually really influence and affect in your community?
Yes. And to get there, in my opinion, it really requires a new metaphysics. Having a spiritual worldview really helps solidify that, because if not, then who really cares? Because we're all going to die anyway. So I may as well just have as much pleasure as I can. And yeah, there's bad things in the world, but I'm not going to waste my time on it. If you think there's a deeper meaning to existence, then the idea of transcending the ego, or at least reducing it, becomes much more of a real priority. Like there's an incentive to want to do that, which doesn't exist among a lot of the people that I encountered, because they don't have that real spiritual worldview. Or if they do, it's very superficial. They might belong to a religion and celebrate certain holidays, but there's not a sense of a deeper spirituality to it, where things matter, where there's accountability at the deeper level. Yeah. And this is getting to why I started this journey, when I decided to write the first book in 2017 about consciousness doesn't come from the brain, because that's the first step to having that realization of a greater sense of meaning and purpose in reality. Yeah. Yeah.
Did the Liberty book coincide with the whole COVID malarkey? I mean, it seems like it could have been inspired by that. Was there any connection between the two?
Very much so. Yeah. I was incredibly distressed by what I was seeing with the mandates and the coercion around injections that people might not have been comfortable with, locking people in their homes, telling certain businesses that they were or were not essential. I just thought it was insane. And especially in 2021, we didn't know when these things were going to end. And if they did end, the precedent had been set of all the government has to do is say, there's a new emergency. You're locked in your home, whether it's a virus or whatever it is that they claim it is, the precedent is set. And I just saw on a global level, wow, they can shut down the whole world based on a hypothesis of what they think is best, based on a mathematical model in the UK that turned out to be totally wrong about the number of deaths. There's a whole story with COVID, which I'm sure you've looked at and covered.
For sure.
So definitely was inspired to do something quickly because of that. I mean, this solution moving towards voluntarism is really long term, but COVID got me looking at it. And what I talk about in the book is not just voluntarism. I do think voluntarism is superior to statism, but I describe in the book towards the end a metaphysical political philosophy, not just a political philosophy, where there's two axes essentially, where on one axis it's let's say it's the vertical axis. You have statism on the bottom, voluntarism on the top, and then on the right is on the horizontal axis is the spiritual one, where you have what I call non-duality, this idea of a universal consciousness that we're a part of on the far right. And on the far left is scientific materialism or physicalism. There's no consciousness beyond, right? So that leaves you four quadrants of different metaphysical political philosophies. And what I argue is that we need to move toward what I call non-dual voluntarism, meaning that the prevailing metaphysics is one of spirituality and interconnectedness, and we move toward voluntarism. And I say that because some people would say, well, Mark, if we are also spiritual, why couldn't we have non-dual statism? Why would that be so bad? And I'd say, yeah, it's probably better than what we currently have.
Right.
But when you have the state structure set up, you are legalizing coercion.
Yes.
And even the most enlightened beings in history, sometimes they will fall. And I talk about this in my second book, An End to Upside Down Living, when I give cautions about spiritual teachers, because as Mariana Kaplan, who's an author in the space, she says, money, sex, and power can corrupt even the highest spiritual people. And it's happened. They take the fallen guru. So by having the state structure, you're allowing for that susceptibility to be there. Whereas under voluntarism, with decentralized power, not illegal coercion, it's relatively better. So that's the argument that I make.
What'd you think, Sugar Plum?
I think Mark Gober has it going on. I think he is a really, really great human being, and I am so excited to see someone who has kind of come from the kind of pendulous opposite side of my reality, embrace the esoteric and things that are of this other realm and in this other consciousness. I get really excited about that because I think there's such a benefit of someone who's come from not only the academic world, but come from kind of the world of the default world, what I call the default world, the world of consensus reality, and who has made this massive leap and is able to take all of his training and hone all of those skills and be able to apply that to writing books about these, huge subjects. And I think he's done such a fantastic job in doing that.
I agree. And they really are dense. They're not thick books, but there is a lot contained on the pages. So I think they're great entry portals to somebody in the same position that he was in. So it's good that he's sort of keeping track of his journey and documenting it with this series of books, because I think it would be easy for someone to start, for instance, with the first one, I'm assuming, because I haven't read the first two, but and sort of take that journey with him, because he throws a lot of crazy stuff out there if you're not used to looking into this sort of stuff, but he also backs it up by a lot of places where you can learn and go and learn and research the same things that he was talking about from the same sources and sort of make the same connections or arrive at your own conclusions. And none of it is proselytizing. It's very much like, well, this is interesting because I found this, and this. So this seems like this might be going on. This might be happening. What do you think? So it's good to follow his journey. And he's not, obviously, not somebody who's closed-minded. He's open to this stuff. And I think it's always compelling to come across somebody who sort of flips, who sort of wanders down a different pathway and does it with open arms. You don't see that too much these days.
Well, it's exciting to think that there could be some other forces at play, that there has been some intercession or some involvement of some higher dimensional being that, to some degree, there could be a selection process, and saying like, all right, well, if this person, if we give this information or compel this person to make this leap, then maybe it will have the greatest impact or the greatest influence. And I think it takes someone like Mark to do that work. And that could be why he is being a vessel that is being used to share this information. And I love kind of getting into those thoughts, because I don't have any evidence of that. But it's an interesting thing to conject.
For sure. And, he's very, very well spoken. And in order to present these sorts of topics, especially to people who aren't used to them and haven't done as much research or peeking into them as we have, for instance, it's really important how you approach it. And I think he approaches it with a very clear and lucid way of apprehending all of this stuff. And he makes a very compelling case. It would be interesting to pass one of his books along to someone who was totally not into any of this stuff and see what they get out of it. I just think they're great.
Yeah, it's so much of that is mindset. And so if you are trying to share information and someone feels like you're trying to indoctrinate them or change their mind, then they already have a shield up, and they're already potentially going to be resistant to whatever the information is. It's kind of like watching a movie. If you watch a movie that has an actor you don't like in it, then you've already kind of set the tone in your mind of whether or not you're going to like that movie. It's like, oh, this person sucks and I hate their movies or I hate this type of movie. So I think that has a lot to do with it. Some people are open innately and just want to consume information. And so they may be more apt to accept things that seem outlandish or outrageous. And I think some people get off on being skeptical and having this kind of reductionist mind where it's like, well, unless this is duplicatable in a scientific arena, I don't want any part of it because that's just all woo-woo.
Exactly. And we consider ourselves woo-woo university, yow.
I would say I'm woo-woo friendly.
I thought you were going to say woo-woo adjacent.
No, I always say adjacent. So I thought I would throw you.
I live with her, so I get to see the material, the callbacks, more callbacks than new material. I'm just kidding. God, I'm one to talk. Oh my God. I have a working vocabulary of maybe 26 words.
Oh, come on. 27.
Thank you. And a half. I can't pronounce the last half of the 27th word. Anyway, so people who have read Mark Gober's books, any of them, including Contact, please reach out to him. Let him know that you heard him on The Melt and that you like him and appreciate him, and tell him why, because he should hear from more of you about why his work.
Yeah. Or if you don't, I think he's open to crits. I think that's what makes life interesting, is that we don't always have to agree. And he's an interesting enough person, and he's sharing enough information that I think if there is some pushback, he may be curious.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. He's an open-minded fellow, as you probably ascertained.
Yeah.
And if you haven't read any of his books, go read them.
Oh my God, yes. I go out immediately and order them. I wouldn't choose Amazon to order his books. No. I would go directly to his website or Abe's books or another source. But I would really urge people to open their minds and hearts and psyches to people like Mark Gober, because he is a font of information, and he is someone who you could say is kind of new to this whole realm and this whole reality. But I think that he's approaching all of this stuff with a fresh set of eyes and an open mind, which makes them, very, very curious,
I know.
I don't know. I kind of feel like I'm a little sleepy. Maybe it's because I've been doing schoolwork all day. I don't know. I feel a little bit compromised, a little bit out of it. I feel kind of vulnerable.
And and you have more schoolwork yet to do, right?
Always. There's always learning, living and learning.
You'll do schoolwork, and I will edit this very podcast. Also, feel free to reach out to us and give us guest suggestions, ideas.
Casserole recipes.
Casserole recipes, T-shirt designs. God, we need new merch. Our logo is fantastic.
We love our logo.
Thank you, Dominique. But let's have a variety, because that logo doesn't really fit on every kind of T-shirt or backpack or whatever the best. So it'd be nice to have a variety of things to choose from. Variety is the spice of life.
Yeah. And we need to delve back into that world. Over my break, I'm going to dive into that and work on the topography that you have, that collection, and see what I can come up with. Those fonts that you bought that were super cool.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But back to Mark. Mark was great.
No, we've moved on to people reaching out to us.
Curious minds think alike. No, they don't. Oh my God.
I'll take it from here.
Yeah, really, exactly. Night.
The Melt Podcast at protonmail.com, or
my eye itches.
Speaking itch at the
Hunter-Muse at protonmail.com.
Thank you so very much for listening. Hopefully you gleaned many positive things from this episode. We certainly did. And stay tuned for wonderful things heading your way. God, you don't even know how wonderful they are.
We've got magical, mystical, mysterious, so amazing stuff happening in our lives, in realms, interdimensional realms. We are connected, every single one of us.
Absolutely. Until next time, fare thee well.
Meow.
To hear the full-length version of this episode, get access to exclusive and early episodes, and participate in our monthly Zoom meetups for as little as $3 per month, just click the Patreon link in the episode notes or visit patreon.com/themeltpodcast. Contributing financially will help to make this podcast my full-time gig that I can devote more time to and allow me to create more content. Other ways of contributing would be giving us a favorable review or rating wherever you get your podcasts, subscribing to us on YouTube, spreading the word wherever you and your tribe congregate, or just by sending us your positive thoughts and intentions. In a quantumly intertwined and holographic multiverse, these also go a long way. Thank you.